And welcome back to another episode of Beginner's Guide to Hololive official card game. So this is the second part, which is about explaining the main deck cards. And if you didn't watch part one, I would recommend watching that, although that content doesn't really have anything to do with this content, so you can probably get away with it not watching it. But if you're interested in playing at events and getting started in this card game, I would recommend watching it. My name is John Hu, and I'm a Pokemon player, plays both VGC and TCG. That's why this is a Sableye. So let's get started in talking about Part 2, main deck cards. A little preface again, a quick review, is that I'm going to assume you know these characters, these talents, or you don't care about them. So I'm not going to cover any lore or explain why this is the way it is. You're just going to have to either know it or ignore it, okay? 2, this is about the cards in the main deck, so I'm not going to talk about cheers, I'm not going to talk about Oshis, specifically. That's going to be for another video later. And finally, I'm going to talk about these card games also. I'm going to use them as comparison mostly. Pokemon, probably a very heavily borrowed mechanic in this game here, and Yu-Gi-Oh!, which has some similarities that I think are closer to that than Pokemon in this game here. So let's look at what we got going forward. So first of all, let's explain holomems. Of course, these are your main attackers. These cards are what you put on the board, and they act as your little monsters if you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Or you're a Pokemon if you're a Pokemon player. You know, creatures if you're Magic. You know, there's a lot of different card games. But I think it's not that hard to understand. This is a holomem. They have a lot of different information present on the card, and it's a lot similar to Pokemon than anything else. So they have something called a bloom level. That would be this guy right here. They have an HP stat of 110 here for Sora. They have a color. Sora is white, so she will get all the benefits and drawbacks of a white character. They have arts, which is the term for their attacks. And they have tags, which is kind of like what kind of a talent is this, as well as like their archetypes. So in this case, Sora is a JP hololive member. She's part of the 0th generation, and she's part of the singing character group. So any cards that mention those tags can search for Sora or apply to Sora if it's an effect that applies to singing, for example. So that's more akin to Yu-Gi-Oh!, I would say, than it is to Pokemon. But, I mean, Pokemon does this a little bit too with ancient and future Pokemon, or like rule box Pokemon, non-rule box Pokemon, you know. But I think it's a little more solidified in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Side. So I would say this is more of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Mechanic than a Pokemon mechanic. They also have something called a baton pass in the bottom left. This is like the little one cheer. This is their retreat cost. So you would pay this by detaching the cheer from the character, and then you move it into the back, and you put a new one in the front. You know, basic stuff. If you played Pokemon before, basic stuff. Now, some of these cards also have an effect, in addition to their arts. So in this case, this first Sora has a bloom effect, which I'm not going to talk about the effects necessarily today, but just know that some cards have effects. Currently in the game, cards that have effects like this, the blue effect here, the blue effect here, they usually only have one attack, one arts. And characters that have 2 arts don't have an effect. So that is generally the balancing that's currently in the game. Some also have an extra rule. This would be a rule box. So if you're a Pokemon player, this would be the rule box. In this case, Sora does not have one, so she is a totally plain, vanilla holomem. There is no rule box there to specify you do anything special with her. It's just a normal Sora. So that's how to read the card. Now, we're going to move on into all the different kinds of holomem cards that you could put in your deck. And if you've played Pokemon before, this might look familiar or sound familiar, or both. And if you've not played Pokemon before, then I guess I have a lot of explaining to do. So, here are all the possible holomem that I prepared for you to look at today. Now, this is going to look very similar to Pokemon. That's because this is a game that borrows heavily from the DNA of Pokemon's trading card game. So, let's start with, it's pretty similar to Pokemon. And the first card I'm going to introduce is the debut stage. Okay, the debut bloom level is the basic Pokemon in this card game. So, in this case I'm showing 2 cards here, 2 Soras. There's this Sora down here in the middle, and the Sora on the right. Now, generally speaking, debuts in this game are broken into 2 categories. One category is a debut member we call the vanilla debut, or some people call it the extra debut. It's because they have an extra rule box that says you can run as many of this card in your deck as you want. Okay, this is a very important core part of deck building, which is going to be in another video. And usually this is the most sought after common in the packs, if you're opening packs. Okay. Because you need a lot of these cards usually. The other kind of debut is the standard card you can only run 4 of in a deck, and typically this kind of debut has less stats than the main vanilla one. It's because they usually have a powerful effect attached to the holomem. So in this case, this debut Sora has like a very, very low 50 HP, but she has a color effect with a strong, actual payoff, so it's worth running the 50 HP little baby. Okay, there are a lot of cards like this that also find their way into other decks that aren't of this character, so it's a pretty good way of designing cards, in my opinion. So those are the 2 debuts. They're basics, so this is what you're going to start the game with. They do evolve into first blooms, and we call it blooming. Okay, that's why it's called a bloom effect. But you can bloom your debut into a first, and here are all the possible firsts that I have discovered or put up here for you to look at. The first one is the one I showed you before, the first Sora. It has a bloom effect, so when she blooms, she just does the effect, and you don't have to do anything for it. Okay. This one on the left is a dual color holomem. Currently in Japan's format, there are only 2 of these in the entire game. They basically just count as 2 different holomem at the same time. So it's pretty similar to like dual type Pokemon from whenever that was a thing, or dual attribute Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I think of like Light and Darkness Dragon, or like you can also be like this card's name is treated as kind of thing. So this card's name is treated as both Sora and Ozki, so it can bloom from Sora, but it can also bloom from Ozki if you have an Ozki. So this is a pretty useful bridge card. Not particularly outstanding in attacks or stats or anything, but it is flexible and you can bloom from and into. And I'll talk about this card in a sec. But once you get your first blooms out, of course the next logical step is to bloom even further beyond to the second bloom stage. So this is our stage 2 in Pokemon. This is your actual payoff of what you're trying to get towards and actually win the game with. These have the most powerful attacks, the most expensive attacks usually, the most expensive baton passes, the most HP, all that kind of good stuff. And these are what you're trying to build towards. Second Sora can bloom from any of these cards in the row here, but second Ozki I've displayed here, like I said, Sora's is both Sora and Ozki, so she can bloom into Ozki also. And that's kind of the whole thing with this game, is you're just trying to build towards your main win con, your main stage 2. I would say like 90% of the decks in this game are mostly second building decks, so they just build towards the second, and then they start attacking and try to win the game that way. And I will say, blooming does work a little bit differently in this game, because once you get to the first level, you can actually side bloom into another first. So this first Sora can actually bloom into Sora's if you really want her to. Or this Sora's can bloom into the first Sora here if you want them to. In some cases you do want to do that. This is also how a lot of the support holomems find their way to decks, with weird ratios like 2 debut holomem and 4 first holomem, because you can bloom a first on top of a first. So that's the whole deal with blooming here. Seconds can also bloom to more seconds, but usually once you get to the second, you stop blooming. Alright, let's talk about this card on the right, the one I was kind of putting off. This is a Buzz. Buzzes are your 2 prizers in this game, so this is the same as an EX Pokemon. Or like, GX or V or any of those mechanics if you're familiar with those. They tend to have a lot of HP, they're really fat, and they usually have pretty good attacks. Some of them recently haven't really had like that much damage output, but their attacks are still generally good, and generally speaking, they like to be put into decks because there's usually a reason for them to exist. And yes, they are firsts, which means you can bloom the Buzz into a second. And this is usually how the Buzz's inclusions work, is that you build a Buzz on the second turn, and then you bloom out of it to actually work towards pushing damage. Aside from like maybe 1 or 2 decks that usually focus on just doing the Buzz. Yeah, so that's Buzzes. There are currently no debut Buzzes. There are currently no second Buzzes, so don't worry about those. finally, there's a last card in the left corner, and you might be wondering, John, what's that? What's this one? It's a spot. This is a spot holomem, which is a special holomem that has no color. It's a colorless holomem. It's also a basic Pokemon by terms of you can put it onto the bench or your backstage from your hand directly or during setup, but it can't bloom. And also you can't start the game with this in the center. So it's a very much a weaker, toned down version of a basic Pokemon. Okay. You can think of this as like your little tech options, like you run Shaman or Manaphy. Those guys don't evolve, right? And they also have like kind of low HP and they don't really do anything except sit on your bench and do like one thing. This is pretty similar to that, except this kind of archetype usually needs to collab in order to get the effect, which makes it a little bit worse than the Manaphy or the Shaman. You just put them out and then they just do their thing. But this time you have to actually collab with them, which, collab is not something I've introduced yet, but this is the main gimmick of this card game compared to other card games. And we'll talk about that when we get to the playing part, which is in a couple videos. Currently, most spots are bad. Some of them are okay in certain deck builds. When you guys get the first set, Pecora here is probably going to be one of the most used spots because she lets you search for a buzz. Very important for some decks. Knoll is also pretty good, but she probably won't be that good until the second set comes out. And the others are kind of, they don't really do much other than sit on your bench and take up space, so not that good. Alright, next we have support cards. So these are your rest of your deck. They're your trainer cards in Pokemon, or your spell cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And there's a bunch of different types. There's 6 types actually. So let's take a look at each of the 6 types. First 3 of the top row we have are event, item, and staff cards. They have this label at the top left. It's pretty similar to Pokemon. They have like divisions of supporter and tool and like, item cards and stuff like that. So not just trainer cards anymore. So this is pretty similar to that in terms of that stuff. And on the bottom we have mascot, fan, and tools, which are more similar to equip spells in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'll talk about them separately. But let's first talk about the first 3 here at the top. The event, item, and staff cards. Now, I'm going to start with the staff cards because they're the easiest to talk about. Nodoka here on the far right is a staff card. Currently the only staff cards in the game are Nodoka and Mane-chan, if I'm not mistaken anyway, and they are limited support cards, which is the same as a supporter in Pokemon. You can only use one limited support card per turn. If you're coming from Yu-Gi-Oh! Or you're coming from not Pokemon, the card text says that you can only use one of this per turn, but it's talking about the card type limited, not the card itself. So you can't play Nodoka and then be like, I then play Ja Tekidane, or So My Enemy, which is the card on the left, in the same turn. You can only pick to do one of those. This is very Pokemon-like. So if you're from Pokemon, this is natural. And if you're not from Pokemon, you might need to get used to it. Many event cards, which is the stuff on the left here, are also limited. In this case, this is limited also. Okay. Most of these cards search your deck or excavate from your deck. Excavation is like a pretty common effect in this card game, so a lot of that going on as well. And items in the middle here, this is sub-Persicom, sub-PC. They tend to be weaker, and you can play as many of them as you want. This is more similar to the items in Pokemon or the spell cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because there's no cost to them usually. They just do their thing and then they fizzle or whatever. They resolve. But yeah, if you play Pokemon, by the way, this card's support cards are basically 1-to-1. At least in the first set anyway. So let me show you what I mean. The first one was Ja Tekidane, which is So My Enemy. It has the same effect as Boss's Orders. It literally just says, switch one of your opponent's back holomem with their front center holomem. And so this is a very powerful effect. If you play Pokemon, you usually need to run a couple of copies of this card in your deck. Next we have Nodoka on the right. If you've been squinting really hard at the card text, you might say that, oh, I figured out what it does. It draws 3 cards. It's Charon, or Rival, or any other card that draws 3 cards in Pokemon, with no downside other than that. Alright, this is your Pot of Greed. This is your Pot of Desires. This is your... any other ones? Pot of Avarice. That's not the one, but, Extravagance. That's the one. Okay, so it draws you 3 cards. Pretty basic, but in this game it's very important, because there's pretty limited draw support. Finally, we have the center one, Sub Persicom. This is more similar to a combination of Pokegear and Pot of Prosperity. Let me explain. So, this card lets you excavate 5 cards from your deck and pick a limited card from there and put it into your hand. But instead of shuffling them into the deck like Pokegear would, it puts the remaining cards on the bottom of your deck in any order like Pot of Prosperity would. And Pot of Prosperity is also an excavate card, and you also pick a card out of that. But it's not limited to what kind of card you pick, and it has a lot of restrictions because it's Yu-Gi-Oh! So I would say this is like a fusion between those two things. And you're going to see that a lot in the excavate cards in Hololive, where excavation happens and the remaining cards go to the bottom of your deck in any order you want. And usually that order doesn't matter unless your deck is really small, in which case it maybe doesn't matter. But that's the whole gimmick with our event item set cards. Pretty simple if you're from Pokemon. They're still pretty easy to understand if you're from other card games, to be honest. Let's move on to your mascot, fan, and tool cards. Like I said, these are your equip spells. They can be attached to your holomem. Their tool cards for Pokemon also exist here, right? So these are pretty simple, but they have some drawbacks or advantages to each other. There's 3 types after all. So let's get into it. First, we have mascots. Mascots on the left. This is Job's. It's a mascot for Aki, Rosenthal. And it can be attached to any holomem. You can equip it to any holomem, but it has bonus effects for the named holomem. Usually it's all upside and basically no downside, so running this is like pretty good in the decks that want to run it. For example, here I have Aki in the front and Ozki on the back. You can attach Jobs to the Ozki and get the basic effect of HP plus 10, but you're not going to get the extra effect, which is, I think, healing on Aki. So if Aki attacks, she would heal. That is not happening if it's not on Aki, so there is a benefit to putting it on Aki. Next we have fans. This fan is Rosetai, which is the fan for Aki. These have a drawback that they can only be attached to the named holo member, which in this case is Aki. But the upside is that you can attach as many as you want. But since you can attach as many as you want, the effect tends to be pretty weak. Let me explain. So here's an example. Aki now has 2 Rosetai attached to her, and is receiving the benefits from both of them. But the benefit from Rosetai is pretty minimal. I think it lets you keep energy once this holomem is downed and move it to a different holomem. You know, pretty weak stuff. Some are very good, some are not so good. I'll show you a good one, you know, a little bit later. Maybe not in this video, but in a later video. And finally we have tools. Tools can be attached to any holomem just like mascots, but they're not all upside. Most tools either have a downside or they have a condition to avoid or get extra benefit. Avoid the downside or get extra benefit. In this case, I'm showing you Axe, Stone Axe. This is one of the best cards in set 1, so definitely pick up as much of this as you can. This is a card that says you do 20 more damage with your arts. But if you attack this turn, or if you attack any turn, anytime you attack, basically, you take 10 damage recoil. You put 10 damage on this holomem. It also has a bonus effect for Aki, where she then also draws a card. And this synergizes well with Job's, so this is supposed to be for Aki, but it turns out this is generic enough that pretty much any deck can use this. And you might be wondering, well, with all these kinds of cards, can you attach all of them at the same time? And the answer is, of course, yes. You can attach all of these at the same time to the same holomem. They're all different, so it's okay to have one tool. It's okay to have one mascot. It's okay to have as many fans as you like. So you can see where this is going. Characters that are this souped up are going to have a lot of cards stacked underneath them. So this is where kind of layering out your cards kind of gets important. But this Aki would be receiving benefits from every single card attached to her. So pretty souped up Aki, I would say. Out of these 3, tools are the most commonly used. Some decks use mascots, and only decks that need fans use fans pretty much. There are currently 3 or 4 in the format that I can think of that use fans like aggressively, like as part of their main game plan. Remember, they do take up slots in your main deck, and they don't necessarily provide as much benefit as like a limited support card, or an item card, or even like a holomem. So you're gonna have to gauge how many of these you want, or if they're part of your main game plan. Alright, and that's it for the main deck. Whew, I talked a lot. 20 minutes of talking about that. So next time we're gonna actually talk about the deck building basics. And that's gonna be it for today's episode leave a like, comment, subscribe if that interests you, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.